Let me say a big welcome to everybody joining us, wherever you are in the world. And I know that we're spreading across some inconvenient time zones here. So it's really wonderful to have all of us connected in this place. I'm just going to give a very, very brief introduction, and then I'll hand over to each of our panelists who can introduce themselves a little bit more. So I'm Liz Maber. I'm a lecturer in the Sociology of Education at the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. I work broadly in the field of gender, conflict, and education, and the intersections of those different fields. And I also coordinate an MPhil route that we have in the faculty called Knowledge, Power and Politics in Education. And we're delighted to have a number of our MPhil students joining us today for this session, including Anna, who's here on the screen and will be leading some of the questions towards the latter half of the session. But I'm also delighted to be joined by our three wonderful panelists today. So we have Professor Nayanaka Mukherjee, who again, I'll let introduce herself and her own work. We have Imran Azad joining us, and we have Dr. Kinma Marchi as well. And the format that we're going to have for the session is we're going to ask each of our panelists to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes themselves. And then we'll have a few questions led by our MPhil students, and then we'll open up to broader questions. So I believe panelists should have access to the chat, but certainly I'll keep an eye on that. And anyone joining the session, you can also post a chat message and we'll see it, and we'll be able to pick that up later in the end of the session when we open up to broader questions. So do feel free to add in any comments there. One final note that I wanted to say before I hand over is just to draw attention to the overlaps and connections between our mutual areas of work here. So for all of us, a primary concern amongst our work is with questions of representation, of inclusion in learning about past conflicts and the experiences and narratives that we're engaged with, avoiding issues of fetishization, sensationalization, and repeating trauma. So that is a kind of guiding theme for our discussions today. We recognize that these conversations can be challenging and that all of us present here will approach these topics from quite different experiences and perspectives of our own. So I just urge us all here to be mindful of the sensitivities, the potential impacts of these discussions. And essentially that is what we're all here to discuss, how we engage respectfully and inclusively about sharing, learning, and building peaceful collaborations. So with that said, I'll hand directly over to Professor Mukherjee, if that's okay, to give us a brief introduction to yourself, your work, and to talk to us a little bit more.
So do you want me to start speaking now? I thought we were going around introducing ourselves, or do you
Oh yes, no, let's do a brief introduction first.
Yeah. Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Imran. Thanks, Anna, and thanks to Liberation War Museum. I am Professor Nayanaka Mukherjee. I teach political anthropology in Durham University, and my work has been on the Biranganas, on the public memories of sexual violence during the Bangladesh War of 1971, which I will talk about today. But apart from that, I've also looked at issues of debates around the War Crimes Tribunal, as well as I've done extensive work with the war babies, and I'm looking at the whole phenomenon of transnational adoption with these adult war babies of the Bangladesh War. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And Imran, can I invite you to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, thank you so much for this session. So my name is Imran Azad. I'm from Bangladesh. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Law, Bangladesh University of Professionals, and currently I'm on study leave. I'm doing my LLM in international law at the University of Cambridge. But apart from these identities, my identity which I'd like to share with all of you is that I'm a volunteer to the Liberation War Museum. So I don't hold any official capacity with the museum, but today I'll be sharing my experience of volunteering with the museum, the work that we have done as a team from the museum regarding the Rohingya refugees back in 2017 till now. Thank you.
Fantastic. And Dr. Mara, can I invite you to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Hello, my name is Kimamachi, and I'm from Burma. And you can say activist, academic, and I'm based at Oxford University, senior research fellow and filmmaker as well.
Thank you so much for those introductions. Anna, is it okay if we come back to you later on in the session? Brilliant. In that case, I shall hand over back to Professor Mukherjee to begin our conference presentation.
So I'm going to share, what I'm going to do initially is share a PowerPoint, and at the end of the PowerPoint, I'm hoping the PowerPoint to be 10 minutes. So if someone can tell me at 9 minutes that I can put 1 minute left, that would be really handy. And then there is a 5-minute clip of a film that I want to show as part of something we have developed in Excel. So that's the plan. Okay. I'm just going to share the screen first. Hang on a second. Just needs to get to the page. And 1 second, I need to share it now. Technology, you'll get there. Okay, yes. So today's presentation is titled Virangana Towards Ethical Testimonies of Sexual Violence During Conflict. And before I start, I want to kind of pay my debts to Liberation War Museum, actually. I first went to the Liberation War Museum in 1997 when I first went to Bangladesh. And I know it's been a very difficult year for Liberation War Museum. We have lost 2 stalwarts, Ali Zakir and Tariq Bhai, over the last year. And that is a massive loss. And I know it's a shock for many people. And that the Liberation War Museum continues in its ventures forward is something really to look forward to. A lot of my initiation into the war of 1971 happened at the Liberation War Museum as well. And this project has been done with my partner organization, Research Initiatives Bangladesh, which is headed by the executive director is Dr. Meghna Takuta, and also the graphic artist in collaboration with the graphic artist Najmin Nahar Kea. So in thinking about what my work has been, primarily I want to talk about my work on the public memories of wartime sexual violence during the Bangladesh War of 1971. And that's work that came out in 2015, and drawing on that, something that we have done is developed a graphic novel, the one with Rib and Kea in Bangla and English. It's available online in Bangla and English as well. And as well as we could turn it into, we had a small pot of funds, and we could turn it into an animation film using the slides of the graphic novel. I'm going to show a bit of that. It's no Studio Ghibli or Persepolis, but it's something I think we are happy to have done it. That's allowed a lot of dissemination. So just turning back to the book, and before I turn to the book, I also want to talk about my own work. Has been on gendered violence, on memorialization, on war babies, as I said, of children who were born during the war, as well as dealing with histories of slavery and graphic ethnography. And within this, one of the abiding concerns has been for me, a question has been how do states remember violent pasts, and the various processes and the conundrums is central to my own research. This comes out for me in the book Spectral Wound, which is primarily brings together the public memories. There's no silence in Bangladesh, I would argue, about the wartime sexual violence, and I will show you how that is. But there is a public memory of sexual violence during the Bangladesh War, and also this book tracks it's not just a work not only a work among survivors, but also it tracks it's a social life of the testimonies, and it's a triangulation of the way in which survivors. It's an ethnography among survivors, as well as among activists, feminist and human rights activists, who was seeking to record the testimonies of the survivors as well as state actors. And the other point of the triangulation is it's an extensive exploration of the visual and the literary realm of the figure of the Virangona, and how that feeds into the ethnography is something that is central to the book itself. So I am myself, I'm from India. I'm from Kolkata, so I speak, read, and write the language. But I, when I first went to Bangladesh in 1997, I was very aware of the baggage that comes with me being Bengali, Indian Bengali. India is the big brother in subcontinent, and the implications that has, and that's something that I'm very kind of careful about. But also it brought back to me what Amitabh Ghosh refers to as a looking glass border. And this is and one of the most striking things I found in Bangladesh is that there is no wartime silence about, counter to all feminist readings that I had, and there was no silence about wartime sexual violence, and instead it is hugely prevalent in public culture. And this comes out, I will move to the slide after the animation film. This comes out primarily in this newspaper article on 23rd December 1971, around 6 days after the war had ended, after Bangladesh was formed on 16 December. On 23rd December, we find that this announcement where the interim government of Bangladesh, headed by, at that point in charge was Kamruzaman, the announcement comes from them that all women who were tortured during the war to be referred to as Virangonas, or what kind of literally translates as war heroines. And this is something which is unprecedented till date, in spite of all these instances of various wartime sexual violence. I know Bangladesh doesn't seem to figure in various kind of issues pre-Bosnia, but Bangladesh, a lot of things, the announcement coming in the early 1970s and 71 was pretty revolutionary, and I feel even till now, though its manifestations might have been different in terms of how it manifested in the lives of the survivors itself. But at the same time, what we find is not just this announcement. In Bangladesh, I went and found in the museum, for say there were these famous photographs. In the newspapers, there were testimonies of survivors coming forward. This is in the late 90s, coming forward and talking about their wartime sexual violence. And some of the examples of these public memory I would show is through this. This is the famous photograph of what is called that hair photograph, Oichuler Chobi, by Naibuddin Ahmed. And I was very lucky to be able to also interview many of the photographers and the context of the photograph taking and the various kind of image making that went into, and the very ways different images were read. So there's this very famous photograph of Naipai, as well as there are photographs in films. So throughout the entire period till now, there's been a huge amount of visual literary accounts of the figure of the Virangona. There hasn't been any silence in the public memory about this. And this is one film among many others. Similarly, there were also advertisements of biscuits to banks. Here of that of Ogroni Bank, and the caption, "Violated Shamoli and her nude sobs want to say never again, no more genocide," coming out in the December 1972 genocide issue of Doinik Bangla. And along with this, we also have rickshaw art at some point, which was after a while stopped by the government in the mid 70s. But we also have rickshaw art bringing out these accounts of the war heroine. And one of the things we find is that the figure of the war heroine often exhibits, is there as a horrific image, as somehow who has been. Often the assumption is that the figure of the war heroine has ostracized by the family members, or they have some physical marker of being marked by muteness and a way which, so physically and socially they have been affected. And this is something that in some ways creates a horrific image, which I've been very found in my ethnography that we need to counter, because often when I would go back, many of the survivors I was working with and who was coming forward to talk about what they refer to as Mela Itihash, Choron Itihash, as in a lot of history, a severe history, is precisely their points about how the very process of testimony, of giving testimonies, has been a process of transgression for them. So it's apart from the very violent experience of wartime sexual violence, which is something that they don't directly talk about, but talk about in what I refer to as fragments. They are also talking about how the process of giving testimonies has been a very, very transgressive process. So as a result, what we find is there is a more, rather than focusing on 71, there's a focus on the post-conflict accounts of their lifetimes. So in doing that, so we find that in the early 1990s, there's a huge focus on wartime sexual violence. And then in Bangladesh, there's a lack of silence. But then even in that public memory, there's a figure of the horrific Virangana and a homogeneous understanding how women have been affected. And yet among the women of their Mela Itihash and Chorong Itihash, it's about the significance of the post-conflict lives. What happened to them after the war as a way of addressing their events of 1971. So in some ways, we cannot address the violations of 1971 without addressing the kind of the injustices of the present itself. The past is not just to be revisited without taking care of the present. So in some ways, one of the central findings we talk about is how survivors of sexual violence found the process of giving testimonies to be an equally transgressive process with negative consequences when ethical practices are not followed by those recording their experiences itself. So one of the things that we go to talk about as a result is drawing from the spectral wound is to bring about the graphic novel that we developed from the ethnography of the spectral wound, which picks up only certain aspects of the spectral wound, and the animation film is all to bring out different accounts of different war heroines. And I will show a little clip, a 4.5-minute clip at the end itself to show why it is important for us to think of the way in which women and their families and the communities have experienced this violence over time. And one of the things that is really important to address is often what is assumed is that wartime violence is marked by stigma, silence, shame. And actually, we need to understand stigma and shame and silence in the way it is evoked by people, rather than seeing it as a given, and often seeing it as a given for quote unquote Muslim societies. It's a stereotype that has often been retrenched. So is that my time cue, Liz? Yeah, okay. So it's really important to then think about the way in which women have lived with their testimonies of violence and the socialities of violence with which they have experienced their wartime rape. And what I'm saying is something that had come up, but also in the there's a story of the graphic novel, which is an intergenerational film story between Lavonno, her Nanu Rehana, and her mother Hena, and what they discover in terms of a family secret, but also there are some ethical guidelines within that within the graphic novel and the film. And here we talk about before the testimonial process of that of training and the need to interrogate our own positions and impact on the research, how we approach the survivors, to question who is speaking, the role of the gatekeepers, how we do a risk assessment that beyond the do no harm policy, as well as during the testimonial process, the importance of time, not just to go fly in, ask people for testimonies without any empathy and just to make them conspicuous in front of the wider family members and communities. We need to understand the history and politics and the multiple memories of the area in which these violations have happened. And this is not just necessarily an anthropological project, which is it can be done by journalists and human rights activists as well, with a shorter span of time, but to be conscious of the nuances that is necessary, rather than imposing an account of what we want the narrative to be. Similarly, the use of secondary material becomes really important. The role of informed consent in terms of not making any assurances or false promises. To understand the economic context of shame and stigma, because often the Viranganas would say, they are causing me stigma because I have a land dispute with them. And as a result, the evoking of my history of wartime rape allows them to put me down. So here, stigma is not something inherent in the experience of wartime rape, but to actually bring about the fact that it becomes a means to which the people who are strong continue to remain strong, and the people who are weak continue to remain weak through this invocation of stigma and shame. It's not given. And so the significance of the post-conflict narrative also becomes really important for researchers to take in mind, and particularly if you're thinking of it in a pedagogical context. After the testimonial process is again a really important process. How do we write about these testimonies and avoid sensationalization? How do we avoid a pornography of violence and write about embodied fragments? The socialities of violence become really important to highlight here. And this is something I talk about extensively within the graphic novel. The use of images and language, the idea of a loss of honor, loss of dignity, these are really problematic terms which are not, rape is rape. It's not a loss of anything from the woman. So it's a problem, it's a loss of humanity on the part of the perpetrator. The role of anonymity and confidentiality really becomes important, and to be seen that this is not just a project. That how do we establish and continue empathetic relationship with survivors, or not just our survivors? We also have fun with them. We also have dark humor with them. We also have relationships over time with them. So this is where I want to kind of one of the comments that came from the survivors for me is, we cried and laughed in reading this book and seeing the film. It should be read and seen by all children and parents. By reading this book and seeing this film, children will not question the war again. No one will question who fought, and no one will ever give quota or scorn to the Viranganas. Along with the children, their parents would read, their mothers would read, and they would get to know about the wars. All our stories are here in this book, and I want this book to be in every school in Bangladesh so that all children know about us. So this is something which came through very powerfully for me, and this is where I want to kind of stop and also ask, in a way, I want to come back to it very briefly after the film to kind of sum up once we see the film itself. So I am going to stop sharing and get to the film, and I'm hoping this is going to work. Okay, and we screen share again, and then go there. Share. Okay. I'll take that off. So here I am talking about the various ways in which Viranganas and their stories need to be understood rather than thinking of them as a horrific wound. And here Laboni is hearing the story from her mother and her grandmother, Nanu Rehana. So I'm just going to make this big and play it. Fingers crossed.
Ferdowsi Priyobhashini, sculptor. During the war of 1971, Pakistani military and her colleagues at work raped her for many months. She had to go to war as she was responsible for the sustenance of her widowed mother and young siblings. After the war, she was mistakenly referred to as a collaborator by her neighbors. As a result, she and her husband, who was a liberation fighter, had to constantly change their home and cities they lived in to escape these rumors. Only in 1999, she told her daughter about 1971. She used to say, if the end of your finger is touched without your consent, the finger would burn. Imagine how it would feel if it is the rest or whole of your body. Her story and sculptures inspired many in Bangladesh, particularly the younger generation. She died in March 2018.
Moina Karim, a landless rural woman. During the war, she was raped by the Pakistani army in the courtyard of her own home. She was cutting fish when she was captured. Holding onto the wooden pole of her house, she thought, I would give my life, but not my honor. After the war, her husband took on the responsibility of cutting fish, and after her son got married, this job was passed on to her daughter-in-law. Moina hasn't cut fish since the war. Holding onto the wooden pole of her house, she says that the pole is the witness of her event. Whenever she sees the pole, she clearly sees the event of that day. In 1992, Moina gave witness against the war criminals at the People's Court. Today, she is appealing to the government to give jobs to her sons and daughters.
Chayarani Datta, a sex worker. During the war, Chaya's mother died and Chaya became alone and vulnerable. Taking advantage of her vulnerability, local collaborators in her village gang raped her. Chaya feels sad when thinking of her mother, as she feels her mother would have protected her and she wouldn't have been raped. She was good in mathematics, and hence, after the war, she started a business of supplying potatoes to restaurants. Sometime later, she decided to take up sex work herself. She follows both Hindu and Muslim religions. As a result of the rapes, she had a girl, a war baby, who is today 46 years old.
Shirin Ahmed had a government job. During the war, she witnessed her husband being killed by the Pakistani army. She was also pregnant. The military raped her and she lost her baby. After the war, she married a cousin, but she always loves her first husband and can't keep his photograph at home. Her second husband does not like it and is jealous of her love for her childhood sweetheart, her deceased first husband. Hence, she kept the photograph of her first husband in her cupboard at work. A few years ago, she retired from her job. Marjina Khatun, hospital cleaner. During the war, Marjina's brother was going away to fight. He had recently married. Look after my wife, elder sister.
When the Pakistani military came to their house, Marjina hid her sister-in-law and another beautiful cousin and put herself forward.
Where are the women in the house?
I'm here. You can take me.
Get into the jeep outside. For 4 months, every night, a military jeep came to pick her up to be raped and dropped her back in the morning. Send Marjina. Don't go, Marjina.
I have to go, or they will find the other women. After the war, neighbors referred to her as a collaborator, and so she left for Dhaka to find work. When I heard we were called Biranganas, I did not tell anyone, but I glowed with pride.
She married. Her children later got separated from her husband. And today, her children have government jobs. She worked as a cleaner in a government hospital and has recently retired.
The military took me by force, but they got nothing from me.
So I want to stop here with 2 points, just to say, in some ways, what I'm trying to say is how different women dealt with the experience of wartime sexual violence very differently, very different from the idea of a horrific wound or someone who's horrific. So we need to understand the way socialities of violence through which women live through it, rather than thinking of them as some kind of horrific figure. So my final question would be, how do we think of wartime sexual violence without thinking of it as a wound? Because in some ways that has implications in the way in which we construct everyday sexual violence and the way in which women are considered, women are figured in these kinds of ways. And this is where I would like to leave the question with the audience. I know there are other questions, and I've not addressed various issues because I know I'm hoping to answer them in the question answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Nayanika, for a very powerful presentation and a very important question to leave us with to consider. It's hard to move quickly on while we've got these ideas and thoughts still very much present that we're thinking about. So I'm sorry for passing rather quickly on to Imran, but perhaps Imran, you want to start with your own reflection and response, and then do please feel free to carry on with your own work.
I hope that you can see my presentation on the screen? Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very difficult, to recount the sufferings and memories of 1971, especially the victims of sexual violence who have sacrificed, everything for the cause of our independence, along with the freedom fighters and other victims. So, uh, despite that, we have some time limitations, and I hope that we'll be engaging in more fruitful discussion regarding the issues and topics that Professor Nanika Mukherjee has just shared. In my presentation, I would like to present and highlight from a different perspective regarding the role and response of Liberationary Museum towards a peaceful future when we are talking about a future with peace, non-violence, and justice. And I would like to focus the role and response of Liberationary Museum in the context of how it has actually played its role as a museum intergenerationally and also cross-boundarily. And here I would also like to draw the examples of 1971 and at the same time the recent crisis that we have just witnessed in Myanmar regarding the Rohingya crisis. Uh, I believe that the audience we have in this discussion, I assume that you know a little bit about the background of 1971. So due to time constraint, I'm not going into the details of the 71 and how Bangladesh got its independence. But the fact is that we had a bloody war and we had to fight against the Pakistani military forces and its local collaborators to claim the independence and to have liberation in 1971. And these are the some of the pictures which I have collected from the Liberationary Museum archive, which basically reflects and depicts that how, people from all walks of life, they have actively participated in this liberation war, and also the sufferings of the Bengali refugees during that time in 1971, as Professor Nayanika Mukherjee was sharing that how actually the government of India at that time helped and assisted those Bengali refugees in their own country. So that's also a part of the history of 1971. But after 1971, when we had our independence, we have seen that immediately after independence, we had our constitution, we introduced a parliamentary form of democracy, the democracy for which we actually had the differences with the government of Pakistan in pre-independence time. So after independence, we had the constitution, we had the government, and the country just started functioning. But unfortunately, in 1975, we have lost our father of the nation. He was brutally killed by some of the members of the military forces. And after that, we have seen that a culture of impunity started in the free, independent Bangladesh. Whereas before 1975, the government of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, they started trying and prosecuting the war criminals and the local collaborators. But after 1975, after the assassination of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, all the legal mechanisms which were made to try and prosecute the war criminals were suspended, abolished, and that was a beginning of culture of impunity in our country. And it continued for a long time, actually till 1990s. During that time, we had consecutive two military dictatorships in the country. And because of military dictatorship, we have also witnessed that how actually those war criminals or those who once opposed the cause of independence in 1971, they have been rehabilitated in the national politics. The religion-based politics became the another identity of Bangladesh during that time, during that dark time. And there was also distortion, manipulation, and a kind of engineering on the history of Bangladesh, on the history of 1971, in everywhere, in textbooks, in national media, and also in the public psyche. So that became very complex for people in general to remember and recount the histories of 1971. So during that time, after 1990s, we have seen that democracy again revived after the fall of the military dictatorship in Bangladesh. And at that time, during 1994, 1996, 8 young people who happened to be the freedom fighters in 1971, and they were very young at that time. So they thought about coming up with an idea of memorializing the history of 1971. And those 8 founder trustees, or those 8 freedom fighters, they basically they established the Liberationer Museum in 1996 officially. So these are the pictures of Liberationer Museum, which was located in its old address in Segun Bagicha in Dhaka, in the capital of Bangladesh. And very recently, in 2016, Liberationer Museum has got its permanent location in another place of the capital. And if you just, compare the 2 museums in 2 different locations, the current one is very big, and it has lots of space for the galleries and also to present the artifacts and the collections in different exhibitions. So when I talk about the intergenerational response of Liberation War Museum, I basically try to focus one of the activities of Liberation Museum regarding the young generation of our country, the generation which didn't witness the 1971. And I also belong to that generation. So after 1996, when the museum was established, it did not only memorialize the history of 1971, at the same time, it wanted to disseminate and promote the spirits and ideals of liberation war among the newer generation who didn't witness the 1971. So one of the flagship programs that Liberation War Museum introduced after 1996 was oral history collection programs and mobile bus museum. As you can see in the pictures, so the idea is that one of the mobile buses of the Liberation War Museum, it would go to different rural schools of the country, and it would hold a day-long event for the students in that school. And there would be different types of activities like documentary exhibition on liberation war. The students, they will get the chance to visit the mini mobile bus museums. Inside, they will see different collections relating to 1971. There will be a quiz competition for the students on the history of 1971. And at the end, the Liberation War Museum Authority, they basically make a request to the students to go back to their family members, to talk to the elder members of the family, and to write the recollections of the elder members of their family regarding the 1971. And after that, when they are done with the writing, they would submit those oral histories or oral testimonies to the Liberation War Museum. And this has been the process for last more than 10 years. And so far, museum has collected 50,000 plus oral testimonies from the students from different schools. Almost 2,000 schools have been covered throughout the country. And museum is now going for second round of holding this oral history collection program. And these are some evidences that Liberation War Museum, after checking the authenticity and the credibility of those stories through a formal editorial process, they also publish those oral histories, oral testimonies in a book format. So these are some pictures from the Liberation War Museum in Bangla. And these testimonies are also available on the Liberation War Museum website. Another activity of the Liberation War Museum is to preserve the killing field of 1971. So this is one of the examples of killing fields in Dhaka, which Liberation War Museum is maintaining for a long time. And apart from memorializing this killing field, at the same time, in the killing field, sometimes the Liberation War Museum Authority, they hold different programs with the students in terms of sharing the histories of 1971. So this oral history collection program and this kind of activity is done basically by the assistance of the network teachers of different schools. So we have a huge group of network teachers in different schools across the country. So coming from that background of intergenerational response towards the 1971 history, Liberation War Museum, after 2017, when we have witnessed one of the biggest biggest refugee crisis of our present time regarding the Rohingya ethnicity, Rohingya community in Myanmar. So on behalf of the Liberation Museum, a group of volunteers, including me, myself, and others, we went to the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, and we talked to the Rohingya survivors and victims in terms of collecting the stories of sufferings and how they had experienced brutalities back in Myanmar and how they crossed the border and took shelter in Bangladesh. So these are some pictures of our volunteers when they were collecting the testimonies from the Rohingya survivors. And I mean, our volunteers, they spent weeks throughout the year with the Rohingya refugees. And we came up with our first publication regarding the Rohingya refugees in 2017. And it was the testimony of 60 on the crisis of Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. It was kind of a publication which basically, I know I have a time limitation, so I'm at the very end of my presentation. So this publication basically portrays the direct testimonies of the Rohingya refugees. And year after, in 2018, we again, I mean, throughout the year, we had our field visit in the camps. We again published another study report, which is called the Rohingya Genocide. It was basically a legal explanation of the testimonies that we have collected from the Rohingya refugees. After that, in 2019 and also in 2020, Liberation Museum had partnership with different organizations. So one was Asia Justice and Rights, AZAR. So in collaboration with AZAR, Liberation Museum had some training programs for the victims of sexual violence from the Rohingya community. So this was Quilt of Memory and Hope. Later on, this was exhibited in the Liberation Museum. So it was basically the showing of the stories of hope and memory of the Rohingya women, the victims of sexual violence, how they have actually imagined all the sufferings and memories of atrocities back in Myanmar. And it was then depicted in these forms of art. And finally, we have our collaboration with also Harvard University Asia Center. It is another effort to memorialize the history and the atrocities of Rohingya genocide, which is called the Thread exhibit. It is available online. And finally, Liberation Museum also assisted in the making of one of the documentary films. It's called A Mandolin in Exile, which basically depicts the the daily life story of a particular person who happens to be a Rohingya individual, and who had experienced the brutalities back in Myanmar, and when he was staying in the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar. So how actually he shares the stories of his suffering and his community's sufferings through this kind of instrument and artifacts. So that's all from my side. I will end now here. So my purpose was basically to highlight that how actually Liberation Museum for a long time was not only engaging the young generation in terms of memorialization, but at the same time, it was engaging young generation to not only learn about the history and sufferings of 1971, but at the same time, to witness the present crisis of Rohingya refugees and the Rohingya genocide directly, and to understand the meaning of peace, justice, and non-violence for the newer generations. So thank you so much. I will be happy to have questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imran, for a really comprehensive introduction to the work of the Liberation War Museum in this field. And again, really nice complementarity emerging in our discussions around the use of creative methodologies in research processes and exploring these issues of experience. If it's okay with you, Dr. Ma, I'll hand over to you to provide your own response and reflection. Dr. Kimamachi joins us from the Thai border, so we're very grateful for you finding the time to come and speak to us a little bit more about the Myanmar context in particular.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mira. That is a wonderful theme that we need to focus on. And everybody knows that Myanmar doesn't need any introduction in terms of violence. We have been experiencing as long as we live. So that is as for me as a political prisoner, activist, women rights campaigner, and academic, working on trafficking, undocumented women, exploitation of women in refugee camps, in conflict area, by the military and police. Sexual violence common, right? It's a sexual violence common. I have seen women, they have to deliver themselves in roadside. I have seen many rape victims. I have interviewed hundreds of them. And I start to think, what do we do, right? And I said, like, it's pain cut through, but then start to think, what do we do? How can we make a difference? That's where also I start to think about transformative research action. How could we make a difference? So that's where, like, I also think about this, and I start to move toward to art, creative methodologies to make people empathize and learn, and so that, like, they will be not only observer, they will be participant observer, involving empathetically. So I did this, I have done it. Let me tell you, like, very shortly, I will not show all detail. I have done, for example, right, Dreams of Beautiful Daughters. This is the film, that documentary film that I made. It is about women who have been sold at the border in Myanmar. When you actually document, you can see 14 years old girl who was telling how she was raped and pregnant and got HIV. 15 years old girl told herself that she was so, when she was told by another woman that she was there being sold to sell her bodies, and she thought she had to cut herself. She had to cut her body parts to sell. And of course, she got HIV. And also, 18 years old HIV sufferer from military rape. She was very happy when she was appointed as a volunteer to taking care of the AIDS sufferers, because she always dreamed to be a doctor. Now, because she got AIDS, she got HIV, she can take care of the AIDS sufferers. When these women told their story themselves, the power is given to them. And also, people can engage with them and they remember it. So that's why I think is really, we need to think, not just only telling their voice. We have to bring them voiceless to voice themselves. And that is where I think is we have to create creative methodologies to teach about this experience. And second part is I'm going to say cooking in conflict. That is something, that program that I also do, the research program. Actually, I invited women from different ethnic area and conflict areas, and we went to camp in the jungle. And that's when they have to share how they cook when they are running away from the military. And then they are also asked to share their life experience and oral history, of course. And when they share detail of how they are being raped, how they deliver the baby, how they have been tortured, they have been buried on the sand, So these things, when they share, these women say that, I thought, why me? But now I'm not alone. I shall live again. That is like a kind of, and this is the project also, I got an oral history of 198 women. So that is where also I saw how they empower themselves because they are given a chance. And I'm also being empowered, and I'm also able to share other people that, like, how we need to act transformative research action and use as a methodology. So in the case of Myanmar, it's like a kind of, we really need knowledge gap, not just Myanmar. I think if we are working in conflict, because of hero and villain, national defender and terrorist, between the two extreme categories, and we lost real pure knowledge. And also, we also lost the history, the past that we were not allowed to learn. We learn only our past, not the other past. In the case of Myanmar, Burmese grown up rote learning system and the pedagogy of the oppressed or the such knowledges. So for example, Buddha is Burmese in Burma. That is unquestionable. As this kind of knowledge that they have learned and grown with. So of course, Burmese are extreme nationalists. So I think there is a really, so in the case of Rohingya issue, ethnic issues, everything that is like they learn from their own small lands. That's where we need to do expansion of the land to share the knowledge. And they will not come, we have to go there with a very creative art forms. And so actually this today, what happened in Myanmar, it's really interesting because the young people, Gen Z has like in the books, small window that they learn. And they manage to learn intersectional approach. They are digital naive and they are very creative. As you may see the protest, they are very creative, they are innovative, they are sending across the message. They are working with Rohingya and ethnic people. And they said that we did not know what you have been through. Now we know. We are sorry. We will work with you to get liberated. So that's what they're saying. So in here is how much education important we need to understand. And also we need to understand creativity in education. We need to understand the power of politics in education. We really need to understand that. That's so that we can actually create such a creative way that to share the knowledge, to construct the knowledge, and to make people learn the other side. So, and in the small windows, now young people in Myanmar, Generation Z, they have 5 million of first-time voters, and altogether 10 million of them need learning technology and fighting for peace. And their message has been an incredible. In Burmese society, let's face it, we are hierarchical society, authoritarian society within even parents and children. So these kids are for the first time, they pushed and they show the society that what they are capable of. Otherwise, Burmese people think that they are playing just mobile phone. They're not much useful. They are lazy, right? They are just showing how much artistic form, creativity can create peace and unity. So let me share with a few slides and I will stop it. Oh, I cannot do that. Oh, okay. So let me start it with that. Okay, that is in the 1st February, and there was a coup d'etat, and there was a curfew. And for the first time in Myanmar, these are all happening for the first time. And as young people use overhead projectors and a showing sign that's peace. That is a lot of people start to say, how did they do that? Right? Something coming out of the heaven. Right? Majestic creature is creating. So actually, there is they are using under the night curfew. There's also CDM. They are actually encouraging people to do that. But also really interesting that, creative form that they just try to use wedding can wait. Peace cannot wait. So, and also that is a start to use Facebook mimistica in the protest of making, making people a kind of variable. And it's really also showing different than 1988. 1988 generations are very emotional. If the military say, we are going to shoot, and they will say, shoot us, we confront it. This generation, if you shoot, we will run because our brass has no bulletproof. So there is some kind of, creativity and they are doing that. And also really interesting thing is that is sometimes now it's coming up together. Or the gay, lesbian, LGBT, and also Muslim, Buddhist. And this is also interesting. This is ethnic language, how to swear at the military. So what I mean, like, you said these are like a kind of using, and also really interesting that like people are using whatever defense to whatever materials to defend the military, but also at the same time they are united. Their aim is to get peace, justice, and liberty for all. So I think it's something that, like, when did it happen? It's really interesting because these young people start to learn and use education as a channel, and they are making for peace. And Burma is that this is the first time Burma, you can see that there's a real change. Not because of in 88th generation we all shout out democracy. We don't know. These children know what the taste of democracy, but also because of education, they are pushing themselves with creativity to use art as a for peace vow. So there is even though like someone died, they will do something like the creativity. So I think it's it's really important that for us that to use very creativity to learn and share about to learn, and a kind of not just teaching but also making participant, to be involved as a participant, and it's only can creativity in education, and we can actually go in next step forward. Thank you. I hope I didn't make it short.
No, thank you, Dr. Ma. That's, again, lots for us to think about, lots of interconnections that we can see, and I'm kind of beginning to formulate some of my own thoughts around the response to your question, Leonika, of how do we think of sexual violence without thinking of it as a wound, which I think is a very well articulated question for us to be thinking about. And perhaps these ideas of creativity that are emerging perhaps lead us, the ideas of creation and generation lead us some way to some potential responses. However, I do want to pass over to Anna to start us off with a couple of questions. I'm aware that we're stretching our time a little bit. We did start a little bit late, so I'm hoping that our attendees here might give us a little bit of grace in stepping over our time limits. Anna, if perhaps I can ask you to simply introduce yourself. You yourself are coming from a background of working in collaborative museum partnerships. So if you could give us a very brief introduction and perhaps just a couple of questions to the panel to get us started.
Great, thank you so much, Liz, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you to Professor Mukherjee, Dr. Ma and Imran. My name is Anna Parker and I'm on the Knowledge, Power and Politics MPhil program in education at the University of Cambridge, and Liz is my supervisor. And this whole discussion that we've had today is really timely because this term we've been focusing a lot on memorialization and the idea of how education and memory and museum work can intersect. And I'm really grateful for people who have sent through questions. It is such a rich topic and there's so much to get through. My personal background is looking at historical conflict and a peace education program between the United States, Japan, and Australia. So that's what I'll be undertaking my research in soon. So I thought I'd take a question from one of our KPP students, Roy, very rich question that I thought we could direct to Dr. Mukherjee and also to Dr. Ma. It is in the chat, but I will reiterate. It is, I guess, a question of positionality. And indeed, it says, if the research is not a project, how would you define the role of the research scholar dealing with such powerful and sensitive events? Does the research scholar need to be more a campaigner and an activist, or does that risk impacting the objectivity of their research outcomes? So Dr. Mukherjee, would you like to respond first?
When I use my title, I'd like it to be called professor because it's hard-earned. So yeah, otherwise Nyanika is fine as well. Yeah, I also want to pick up the point, the question about personal inspiration and this question together, which came to me earlier, as a way of thinking. For me, it's been really important. While I know Imran said India helped Bangladesh in this whole in the whole context of 71, but at the same time, 1971 and the history of sexual violence is often used by India in terms of Pakistan bashing. And, I do not want my work to be part of that. You really need to be very careful of what project you want your work to be taken up. And it runs a risk of it being taken up in that way. But so while India did help Bangladesh, but at the same time, there's a whole different perception within India about 71 itself, which is very problematic. So I'm very conscious in terms of I need to contest Indian nationalism around this issue and why and identify why 71 is being focused within India as well. It has very different stories, why 71, and there is nationalism in all our stories, whether Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, and that really needs to be interrogated in the light of thinking about education and conflict and the idea of peace, quote unquote, right? So I really want to address that because for me, the inspiration was in 1992 when the Babri Masjid was attacked, and it was my first formative experience as an undergraduate student in Calcutta, where my home city, and rumors about sexual violence across communities came through. At that point in the 90s, there was, you had the different kind of treatment of Bosnia and Rwanda. People were, oh, how could this happen in Europe after we have said never again? And then people like the UN left Rwanda to its did not help Rwanda. So there was already a kind of bifurcation in terms of how racially sexual violence was being addressed. So for white Europeans, we can address it, but for Rwanda, we leave them. So that was coming through in the early 90s. At the same time, we were getting accounts of partition narratives from feminist scholars. I was hugely, feminist sensibilities came to me early, and the work of Veena Das, Urvashi Menon, Ritu Menon, Urvashi Batalia, all of their work, we were reading it. And this was me in university in Kolkata. And then I went to JNU, which is in Delhi. And that was a very formative period, but also to say, I got to know about the announcement about Bangladesh, about the women, about being called Viranganas, which was like, what? I was reading feminist stuff about everything is silent, there's no one talks about rape, and that at one level is true, but another level it is not. Even in the case of Bosnia, women are willing to talk about it because often sexual violence is often being used as propaganda by states across time. If you look at it, women's testimonies might not have been focused on, but there has always been a focus on wartime rape as propaganda for different states to demonize the other side. So for me, and the UN declaration of wartime rape in 1995, Japan's kind of position around not giving apology, and the Japan issue has come from women. Issue has emerged in a very, very controversial way recently, as we know, with the whole stuff still going on. So for me, the role of it's not about activism, but I think it's really conscious to be doing this research, interrogating one's own position about doing it. So it's not a project by what I mean is it's maintaining those relationships beyond the duration of the project is really important to see people or people who are give you testimonies, not just as a source of testimony, but they are friendships, they are relationships, right? And this is something I bring out in the graphic novel on page 8. It's my favorite page where we are talking about, I was given a goat during my fieldwork time, and there's one of the survivors taking a photograph of me in the mustard fields. And, those are the times we also remember the dark humor, the Viranganas. So, I mean, I would disagree with Imran to call them victims. They're survivors. They are not victims. And their accounts, and precisely, we just don't need to think of them through only their sufferings. Their sufferings are known through their stories that they say. So just focusing on suffering, again, creates a wound, them as wounded, right? We need to kind of highlight their life trajectory through its very textures, like Shireen's story about not being able to keep her husband's photograph at home because of a second husband. So I think we need to think about, so it's not just about, I mean, again, the idea of objectivity in anthropology, we would say objectivity is a subjective position itself. So I think wearing all these positionalities on your sleeve is really important to highlight the way in which you bring out your involvement in the project. That is really important for people also to interrogate you, not just you go and work with researchers, but people also need to interrogate the researcher who's coming and doing this work itself. So I would rest on that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's really important for us as young researchers to be constantly reflecting on our positionality and that idea of, sorry.
No, go on, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, and that idea of it being a two-way street, it's not just all take, and then run away with the information.
And also, I think it's really important to highlight our privileges, which we carry, and the baggage we come with it. It's really important because people question that.
And I also think that, you know, researchers, social scientists, or anthropologists, we are also human, right? Like, you know, we are not programmed with the machine mind, right? Like every researchers, you know, we are somehow biased of what you do, particularly if we're not doing science subject. So that is like, you know, that is something. And if we're looking at, you know, previously history of academia, anthropologists can previously anthropology is colonial field, foreigners field, right? Because like natives are so closed. You know, so that is how they define anthropologists, right? And also, of course, like if you are human being, you are impacted by what you see, what you experience, and what you're passionate about. So that is, we all have it. But in terms of, you know, you might hear, many of you might hear, Nancy Shepherd Hughes, Death Without Weeping, very good anthropological test, you know, in Shanti down in Brazil, how she experienced mother, the child is dying, mother cannot feel anything, right? Like, and so actually that, like, we get the two, you have to mingle with that. But also, and in terms of like, as a social anthropologist, social scientist, we need to have a moral responsibility. We have to have the ethic. That's like, that's really important. And also we have to gain trust. Trust will not come to you automatically. You know, you have to gain the trust. So, and also like, these are the things that we need to really think. And yet, for instance, like, when I buried 38 women, one by one in Taipamagora, it affected me. You know, like, all their family will not know. But what can you do? And also on International Women's Day, I organized women activists from Myanmar to give a talk. But they were chased by the soldiers. So they were hiding under the leather, and they still give the talk. So actually, still, it is really important their story to be told. If it is possible, we should help them to tell the story themselves. Thanks.
Thank you so much for those rich personal insights. It's incredible to hear real stories from the field. We can read all that we want as young students in our bubble in Cambridge, but to actually have these personal insights, yeah, thank you so much from both of you. Do we have time for some more questions, Liz?
Do we go for one more? Shall we
one more?
Push our luck a little bit?
Okay, and then I was going to say there are a lot of questions I have, especially about the Biangonas, so I would really like to send those through, and if you have time, that would be fantastic, Ayanaka.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. I'm really fascinated by the whole concept and history. But sorry, Imran, I will come over to you now. Thank you so much for joining us on KPP last week. I guess what I'd like to ask about is the idea of the oral history recordings, and of course the youth who are being able to ask these questions and interact with the past are greatly benefiting. But I'm wondering what kinds of benefits you've seen elders or survivors feel from being able to share their stories.
Yeah, so I mean, before I reply to your question, just to clarify my position on the uses of the word victims or survivors. So if you remember that the study report we published in 2018 regarding the Rohingya genocide, we actually used the term survivors, not the victims. Maybe this is my preconception or prejudice of using the word victim, but definitely it's because of my background with law. I mean, how law actually portrays survivors not as survivors but victims. So that's why basically maybe I have used that word. But yeah, definitely I appreciate the disagreement that we have with Professor Nayanika Mukherjee regarding the uses of the term because of discipline variation. But the question, coming to the question of, I mean, the benefits or advantages that elderly people are having by sharing their stories, I would say that, I mean, maybe in terms of, I mean, if we think materially, they are not getting any advantage or benefits of sharing their stories, but they are actually giving a narration or testimonies to the newer generation who didn't witness the 1971. So it's not, I mean, it's more of the advantage for the newer generation than for the elderly people who are sharing the stories. But apart from, I mean, collecting testimonies from the survivors and also from the elderly members of the family of 1971, Liberation War Museum also was associated with an effort to make a list of victims of sexual violence of 1971, which was later used by the Ministry of Liberation War Affairs in Bangladesh in terms of recognizing them as freedom fighters. And, you know, like recognizing them as freedom fighters has some monetary and other benefits that are associated with that recognitions. So I would say, I mean, they don't have any advantage because they have sacrificed the highest things of their life. And by sharing their stories, they are basically doing the favor to the newer generation of knowing the histories of 1971. And I mean, because of the political changes that we have after 1975 till 1990, so that was also a setback, a pitfall for the nation of Bangladesh, not to know the history and even not to be allowed to tell the history or stories of 1971 nationally, publicly. So I think it's more an advantage for the newer generation to know the histories from the, you know, the survivors of 1971.
Thank you so much, Emran. Yeah, that's specifically my area of interest, as and a few of us as well in the course have looked at the idea of, I guess, the reciprocity of that intergenerational connection, and I guess even in some cases a sense of healing that can come through being able to share those testimonies. So thank you for your insights, and I have lots of questions to send on to you as well.
I can see there's a couple of questions that have come through from the Q&A function of the setup here. So I wonder if we want to just take 1 or 2 minutes to very quickly react to those. There's a question specifically for Nayanika and a question for Imran. I don't know if you can see those directly typed there. But then I am very conscious that we have stretched our time limits quite substantially. So we'd probably better draw it to a close, but I don't want to have questions left unaddressed if there is a response that we can provide quite quickly. Are you able to see those?
Would you like me to copy those into the chat?
Yes, please, Anna. That would be great,
Sure.
actually.
Sorry that I missed those.
No
I
problem.
can see the questions. I'm not sure whether Professor Mukherjee can see the questions. The questions are on Q&A.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see it. Okay. I mean, well, I could go. I could answer.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, is that? Do you want me to
sure.
first, or maybe
Yeah,
Imran?
sure.
I mean, one of the things about, I think I would also address the question about the museum, which is one about people's use of languages of dignity and loss of honor and all of that. And I think all those things need to be kind of taught, retaught. Using those languages is really patriarchal and kind of still like has honor located in some kind of body part of the woman. It's regressive and really there's nothing. We just need to not talk about it. And I know the government also talks about it, but I think we don't need to talk about it. But I think one of the, and this links to a third question I got as one of the lists, which I can combine with the question I was asked, the question about the youth, about what lesson we can learn from this, what kind of pedagogical lesson. And I would think in some ways the way in which Viranganas themselves talk about the past and the present. that we can't just talk about the past unless we talk about the present. And here, since I have been working on the graphic novels and animation film, something that comes to me in very contemporary times, and I think which many young people are asking this question, which I'm in touch with many young people for various kind of connections, is how is the Liberation War Museum, while engaging with 1971 and its Shotik Itihas, or the right history, which was distorted in the past, but where is it standing in terms of where people have just died in prison as a result of the Digital Security Act. The cartoonist Kishore has just been brought out. So where does the museum also stand about its present when it's in its continuous engagement with the past? The past. So many younger generations feel that the past 71 becomes a kind of a sell-by date. A product which is gone its sell-by date unless it engages with the present. And this is something for me coming from the survivors itself, where they're asking the present needs to be addressed and to have a moral compass in actually establishing the future ahead itself. And that is something I would say is something I've learned as a lesson from my work with the Virangana Chatis itself. And there, I think there are loads of questions there for the Liberation War Museum going ahead.
Yeah, just to briefly answer that question, I mean, it's very difficult, to locate the role of a museum, which is basically a non-government initiative, and its role towards the memorializing history. And also, as Professor Mukherjee has referred to the, relating the past narration, past histories, past sufferings to the present crisis, I do completely agree with that notion of that, whether a museum can also pick and choose its role towards memorializing the history of past and also dealing with the present for a future. But in the context of, as Professor Mar was saying, that to share the knowledge is also an attempt to construct a knowledge. So it's basically a constant dialogue of the society, that how actually museum takes the role towards the memorialization, the history, and to deal with the present. And at the same time, we also need to understand that, it's not only about the role of Liberation War Museum to depict all the histories of 1971 or to relate the past with the present. It is one of the initiatives. There are other actors from also state and non-state actors. So how they also actually play a role in this whole environment is very important in a politically sensitive democracy. So keeping everything in consideration, I would say that Liberation War Museum has its own strategy to deal with memorialization process and towards the future. And definitely, I think it's also the responsibility of the museum to revisit its strategy, also to understand the present crisis that we are having right now in the country. Definitely.
If I can I just one thing? And it's interesting that there's a focus on the Rohingya refugees so much intensively in the museum, which is great. And this is why I say the nationalisms of each of our countries are very much at stake. How we construct conflict in education. If we don't interrogate the nationalisms in our practices, in our very pedagogical practices, it's going to be a failed process. It's going to be a fruitless process. And I feel in some ways, younger generations feel there is need for more of a vigorous position of the moral compass about organizations which stand for freedom and are not then calling out on freedoms itself. Because 71 is an important issue, and it needs to be important continue going forward. Just set up campaign lessons. That was one of the questions that was sent to me.
Absolutely. I think that might be the note that we have to end on, I'm afraid. And I'll ask our colleagues in the Liberation War Museum and the conference organising team. I think they're present in the session as well. to join us in thanking all of our panelists for your really insightful contributions. There's lots for us to continue thinking about here, and I very much hope we can continue these conversations.